what does it mean? It means you be ready to go, okay? And you may be here and you're thinking, hey, I'm not really training for pastoral ministry. You still better be ready to go, okay? Because you are going to be more equipped, trained than probably most people in your churches. And I've been in context too. Let's say you have a chance to go on overseas mission trip, and for sure, you are going to have so much more Bible knowledge and equipping than most people. You and me. I've been in contexts where you could just share the most basic thing, and it's just I've never heard of. Right? And so I'm here with a sermon in my back pocket. We had just sickness. I don't know about your church. I mean, something's coming around St. Louis, right? Someone told me the other day that St. Louis or Missouri has been one of the most harder hit states with the flu this season, and so we just had some lightning strike Brooks Bible College in the last day. Dr. Dean Henderson, sick. President Thurman just let us know, hey, he's not feeling well. All right, so I'm pinch hitting today, and I hope that we can just be blessed by what God has planned for you to hear today. I saw. This was a couple weeks ago. I saw, it wasn't so much of a highlight reel as a, man, did you see what happened this basketball game the Chicago Bulls were playing? And this guy, just got a breakaway, got to the ball, he stole it from an opposing player, and he's charging down the floor, right? No one's guarding him. He goes in for the dunk, and he's going to showboat a little bit. Holds the rim a little bit too long. He's in swing motion, and he loses his balance, he loses his orientation, and man, he comes flat on his face, hits the ground, and the camera zooms in. Oh man, his whole front row of teeth are just gone. Okay, and you just ask yourself, what possesses someone to do that? I mean, no one was standing in his way, and he's got to make a big deal of it. The truth is, if you play basketball, it's all about the dunk. Okay, the dunk is the play of power, right? It's fun. I can't dunk, so I imagine that it's fun. Actually, I have dunked many times on those rims that you shorten them to 7 feet, and you're all over the place, right? That's a lot of fun, okay? But for these guys who can really do it, I'm sure it's fun. But it's more than that. It's not just about fun. It's a claim to dominance. It's like saying, "This is my house. This is my game. I own this game, and I own you." Okay, that's what the dunk. It's about. It's a proud boast on the basketball court, and pride is such a problem, isn't it? We just think, we go through life, we just think that we're all that, and we're just falling on our faces all over the place, just like this guy. We just really reveal that we're arrogant, foolish, and in love with ourselves. When I was in high school, I had a basketball coach. His name was Coach Crummett, and he was just, he was one of these kind of old school gentlemen. Okay, he was a gentleman, but he also would tell you, things straight up. Just right in your face. Hey, this is what you're doing wrong. But he treated us young men with a sense of dignity. This is the first time that I remember someone in this kind of authority position calling you Mr. Clutterham, you're up. I don't know if Dr. Wilson, if you do that in class, but Mr. Coons, do you have something to say? Mr. Kleins, yes. There's just a sense of, hey, not Austin, not rural, but just a sense of, hey, the dignity. And that was how he functioned. And to him, basketball was all about fundamentals. Okay? And he was so exacting in his teaching us technique. We would practice to the T, all the standard plays, pick and roll, dribble drive offense, triangle offense. I mean, we were just practicing the fundamentals all day long. Except for the end of practice. At the end of practice, we would scrimmage. So we would play a practice game. And we had just this opportunity to, in our minds, let loose and play the game. I mean, it was all about fun. And when it came to those games, it was like we forgot everything he taught us. It was every man for himself. It was all about your own personal glory. It was all about the big basket. But he would be standing on the sidelines, yelling out, "Remember the fundamentals!" and get in tight there, and let's get into post position. And we needed that. But that's not how we played. In so many ways, it really parallels the Christian life, because we should really have down pat our battle with sin and temptation. I mean, that's like bread and butter for the Christian life, and yet we still need reminders. And we're going to see in our passage today that pride isn't just foolish, but it's dangerous. And if we don't take a stand against it, then pride will take away any hope for ministry that you have, and it will kill you in the process. And so we're going to look at a text from 1 Corinthians today. And when it comes to 1 Corinthians, let's give you a little bit of an overview, because I want to show you something. But written in AD 55 from Ephesus, Paul's writing it on his third missionary journey when he's in Ephesus for 3 years. And Corinth, the city that he's writing to, I mean, it's just known, I mean, it's infamous, right? What does it mean to be Corinthian? Okay, someone told me that they're a pastor of a church called Corinthian Baptist Church. I'm like, who named that church? That's not a good sign, right? That's not your claim to fame. I mean, they were known for all sorts of wickedness, debauchery, moral depravity. Like many of these Greek cities, there was a Acropolis in the middle of them, so a place where kind of like a mountain, and on top of the mountain would be a temple. And in Corinth, there was a temple to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and what they were known for is there was a prostitute cult where these female prostitutes, part of their worship was sexual immorality. And there was professional prostitutes that were part of this pagan worship system. And the start of the church in Corinth was a calling out from this culture, and just the worst type of things. And there was at least 1,000 priestesses who were part of this prostitution cult. And so we're going to just look at 1 Corinthians as a whole quickly to just show, hey, there's just so much evidence of pride. In the first 4 chapters, we see that they were dividing themselves up into factions. They had claims of, hey, I'm of the Apollos group. Okay, he's my guy. Okay, and others, Paul. I learned everything from Paul. I'm with Paul, or I'm with Peter. Okay, or no, I'm with Christ alone. Okay, I don't listen to these human teachers. I'm with Christ alone. And Paul starts to give counsel to their pride. He says things like, did you know that God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the foolish things to shame those who say that they're wise. He says, you are servants, and you don't have anything to boast about that you haven't been given. In chapters 5 to 7, he's exposing that there's a looseness with sexual sin amongst them. That they're not dealing with it. They're just allowing it to kind of fester, to remain among them. And all types of confusion about marriage and the covenant relationship of marriage. And they were not willing to break fellowship with some of these just clearly disobedient people. And Paul calls them out on it. He says things like, you think that this won't influence your whole church? He says things like, I've already judged this situation. Put this person out of the church. He tries to clear up so much of their misunderstanding about marriage. In chapters 8 to 10, he's focused on an issue having to do with food and meat that was sacrificed to idols. And really the issue is not the food, but it's the way that individual believers treated one another with respect to their preferences. Okay, we'll come back to that. In chapters 11 to 14, he's really pointing out there's such an extreme selfishness, divisiveness, and boasting. One of the specific examples of their selfishness was the way that they treated each other in terms of the meal when they gathered together. Okay? So, we all know the passage 1 Corinthians 11 because it's a passage typically read when we celebrate the Lord's Supper. I don't know what the practice is of your local church in terms of frequency. What's it in terms of frequency?
We do about 6 times a year.
Okay. Is that kind of like the fifth Sunday approach, or?
No, it's the first of the month every other.
First of the month, every other month. Some others. What's the approach?
I don't know if I know. I think it's once a month.
Once a month.
I don't keep track.
That's very typical. Once a month. Any church do it every week? Every week.
Once a month,
Once a
first
month.
Wednesdays.
Once a month. Okay. So in the Corinthian context, it was every time you get together, there was a celebration of the Lord's Supper. And in their context, here's a scenario. There was a mixture of poor and rich. And when you're poor, guess what? You're working a lot. Okay? And so you're working day shift, you're working swing shift too. And when you get off of work, you head to the church meeting, and guess what? You find out, hey, they already started. They started a couple hours ago. They've already been celebrating the Lord's Supper, and nothing's left. And Paul's saying, you can't even wait. You can't even wait for those who are about to join it. They come in and they're humiliated because it's even more exposed that their poverty keeps them from this meal. He says, look, if you're so hungry, then eat at home before you come, and don't do this to your brother. So things like that we see just rooted in pride. And Paul calls them out. He says, prefer one another, wait for one another to arrive before you start eating. They also believed a false teaching concerning that there might not be a resurrection. And Paul has to correct their theological error to tell them about there is a resurrection, and because of that there is a final judgment. So what you do here, it matters. But we could say pride is the vice addressed on every page of this letter. And part of that's because pride is the mother of all sin. It was the first sin. It is the sin that we could say is the head sin that all sin is connected to. And so we're going to look at our passage today that falls into the middle of this whole context when Paul's addressing their sinfulness of pride, we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 10, 1 to 13. And so go ahead and turn there. And this passage, it falls into that section where Paul's addressing their liberty with respect to meat offered to idols. And how they were raising their preferences over their commitment to the well-being of their fellow Christians. He wants to expose their pride, and he wants to warn them that pride's foothold in their lives is a stronghold for the enemy. So let's read this passage. We're going to start actually in chapter 9 and verse 24. Okay. So he says, "Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath." That was the reward for these runs, right? "But we for an imperishable. So I don't run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body, and I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." Okay. So now as we read this second part, I want you to keep in mind that this passage is driving towards verse 12. Okay. So there's something it's building towards. So let's, chapter 10. "For I want you to know, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come." Verse 12. "Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it." As we look at this passage, we just want to highlight a few different sections. One is that end of chapter 9. And Paul is really saying in humility that Paul pursues the Christian life as an athlete pursues sports. Embracing self-control in the arena of liberty. You see, an athlete, I'm going to say we're getting ready to witness the 2018 Olympic Games. Okay, I mean, the best athletes in the world are going to South Korea, okay, to compete against one another. And you know, there's a lot of things that they could be doing. They could be just, well, I think, you know, their actual race or event probably happens, I mean, we've watched them, they're over and done sometimes in a matter of minutes. Okay, they train for all those years, and they're amongst an Olympic Games that their part is so small. I mean, that they could spend almost all their time like a tourist there. They could engage in so many different things. They could walk around with their medal and just live it up. But athletes didn't get there by living that way. They got there by embracing self-control, by limiting themselves in the midst of their liberty. And Paul says, look, this is what I do. And I want to tell you something, that you are in the same battle. He says, let's just think about this whole opportunity of liberty with a past example. Okay? So when he comes to chapter 10, he says, let's think about the Israelites. Now, we know so much about the Israelites because God was intent on giving us an example. Okay? And he wants to tell them something about how they experienced a redemption, a deliverance from Egypt that gave them access to so much liberty. Okay? But what I'm not going to do is try to pick apart all these parts. If you're taking Professor Kirkland's New Testament course this afternoon, I want you to say, before you start, I got a question. I want you to tell me about what was the cloud and how was the rock Christ in 1 Corinthians 10:4. Okay, just a small question like that. All I want to do is I want to show you this, that the reason the point of these 4 verses is to say, look, the Israelites experienced something like you experienced in terms of your liberty. When they were delivered from Egypt, they experienced supernatural experiences. They were immersed in the presence of God's glory. And somehow they were sustained by Christ. Okay? When they drank the water, that was God providing for them. It was part of God's plan of redemption, which culminates in Christ. And so their situation is relevant to us. Okay? And let's see what they did with it. Were they like athletes in the wilderness? No, they weren't. Look at verse 5 again. He said, look, you need to think about them as an example. They had a situation like you do, but with them, God was not pleased. How do we know that? They were overthrown in the wilderness. In verse 6, now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. And that's in verse 11, he returns to that idea of they were examples. We know about them because it was written down for our instruction. Okay? So this section is about bad examples. You know, I remember, I've not seen one of these posters for years now, but you might have walked through doctor's offices, dental offices, maybe financial advisors. You walk down their hallway and they have these posters that are motivational posters. And it has a picture and then it says a word like character. Okay? And then it has just a great quote. And you read it and I'm like, all right, yes, I'm going to have character today. That sounds good. Or integrity. Okay? And you read it and it's like, yeah, right on. Well, someone started this spoof off of that and they called them demotivators. Okay. One of them was like, it said something like loneliness. Okay, and then you read the quote and it said, when you think you're lonely, you probably are. Very, very lonely, right? But another one of it was, it was something like, warning, when the purpose of your life is only to serve as an example for others not to follow. And you read this, it's like, oh man! we read their example, it's a bad example. And it's written down so that we would not follow it. Some of the things that they did, they went through they were delivered from Egypt through the parting of the sea, and you would just think, wow, if I had experienced that, man, I would just be the bravest warrior against sin and temptation in the whole world. But what did they do? They feared the absence of Moses when he was on the mountain for too long, and they used it as an opportunity to sin. They rose up in idolatry, drunkenness, and when it says they rose up to play, it's a euphemism for sexual immorality. Okay. I mean, we're not talking a long time after coming through this amazing deliverance before they used their opportunity for sin. Two more things, at least. One, that they grumbled at the scarcity of food, and in the wilderness, they were bitten by snakes. And then it talks about them grumbling again, and they were destroyed by the destroyer. Okay, so here's the point. The Israelites had such an opportunity, experiencing a redemption, something like what we experience. And yet, they used it for sin. And why? Because of pride. And pride working itself out in lack of self-control. So let's look at just these last two verses specifically. The warning in verse 12 is, therefore, so because I just said this, because they fell, and they experienced something like you, therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. But what does pride do for sin and temptation? You know, pride it's a massive advantage for the enemy. It's like giving him an upper hand in temptation. It sends a signal, you think about this, it sends a signal that all my faculties, we're not on the same page. We're not united. There's something about me that likes more about what you're offering than not. I'm already leaning towards giving it. Pride is a leaning towards temptation and sin. And it makes you more committed to your liberty than careful to embrace self-control. I'll skip some things here, but there's a whole book written by a Puritan named John Owen on sin and temptation. It's called On the Mortification of Sin. And here's maybe a synopsis, 4 things that he has to say so that we could just be a little bit wiser in terms of temptation. The first thing is that temptation links to something that is already inside of you. And just think about if I was in battle and was part of a walled city, okay, or just part in some kind of war, it would be like this idea that there are residents in this walled city that are actually spies for the enemy. They actually would like to see this city fall. And they're working for your destruction. So there's already something that has a connection to what's outside of the walls more than a commitment towards the city itself. It works its way out in things like when James talks about that each one is carried away by his own desire. This is from the inside out. Romans chapter 7 talks about sin that dwells within me. And when Jesus was talking about his disciples and that conflict about the washing of hands, he says, for from within, out of the heart of man, does all this type of sin come from. Number 2 is that it presents something to which you're genuinely attracted, either by tragically making you attracted to the wrong things, or by deceiving you and not keeping its promises. So temptation either works to make you attracted to the wrong things, or by deceiving you and then lying to you in the process. It doesn't keep its promises. Number 3, it appeals to the needs of human sustenance. Right? It takes into account that we are human, that we are of the flesh, which means that we have need, and it appeals to it. So Jesus says the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, and his disciples fell asleep. Number 4, it follows a brilliantly wicked strategy. Every time, James just maps it out. He says that each person is lured and enticed by his desire, and then desire, when it's conceived, it gives birth to sin and death. And so the warning is, you gotta watch out. The person that thinks that he stands is liable to fall. You know, you maybe just think about sometimes when you think that you're not in a state of motion, but you actually are. The thing that I just thought about was, you know, like the roller coaster. You're going up at the start, and then you get to the top, and you hear the release, you know, the pressure, and for a second, it just feels like, hey, I'm gonna get going. It just feels like you're there, but you're in motion. Pride convinces you that you're standing when you aren't. And when it comes to a roller coaster, it's just you're not stand still. You're falling slowly before you come to a crashing, escalating speed. The Bible talks a lot about our walk, but it also talks about how we stand. Okay, I'm gonna just give you just 2 illustrations. We're close to time. There's 2 times when I can remember someone telling me how to stand. Okay, probably more, but for the sake of illustration, I remember this basketball coach. He says, "Look, when you're in defensive position, you stand like this." Okay, so one is trying to knock the ball out of their hand, and one is guarding the pass. Okay, that's kind of like a surfboarding too. The other was I worked with a security group for a while, and it was it was something like this, with your hand kind of right here, okay? So the idea is, I'm firm, I'm planted firm, and you don't know what I have in my backhand. I don't have anything, right? But you don't know that, okay? And so it's a position of power. But the thing that they both have in common is the widening of the stance. Right? I am standing on purpose. And I'm not going to be pushed over. And when it comes to our standing as Christians, we stand by faith. We stand firm in our convictions about God's Word and what it says. We stand with spiritual armor. We stand according to our conscience and God's strength. We stand firm in liberty when it comes to legalism. But we stand strong as we stand against pride and with humility. And I'll just say, let's look at this last verse. But that whole warning causes us to be watchful. Watchful and ready to pursue God's way of escape. So there's 4 things about verse 13. Looking at it really quickly again. What does it say? No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, He will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. So here's number one, 4 things. 1, there are no supernatural temptations, only human ones. So that means that in your life, that you will never face a temptation that is not in the category of human. Okay. Here's the encouragement about it. You will never face a temptation that cannot be beat. Never. But here's maybe the reflection. Every time that you have been beat and sinned by temptation, it was a battle that it was yours to win. And you lost. Why? That anyone who thinks that he stands, take heed lest he fall. Number 2, but God is faithful in the midst of temptation to provide a way not to fall. He will not let you be tempted by your ability. Some people say that, they say, God is only going to give us what we can handle. Okay? It's not quite that way. That, God is just going to only give you what you can handle. They take it a long way. So, you're really hungry, trying to stay on a diet, and you drive past the word. I'll just call it McDonald's because it just came to mind. But it's not, I drove past it. God wouldn't have let me drive past it unless he wanted me to just buy the Super Big Mac. I forget what they're calling that. The Grand Mac. Okay. It's not exactly like that. He doesn't take away the temptation, but he does provide a way to endure it. The escape route is through the temptation, not around it. Okay? We can say this. What does the escape route entail? We'd have to look at all the Bible, but here's just a summary. Heed warnings. So take heed lest you fall. 2nd, in humility, understand your own sinful flesh and make no provision for it. Value examples, both good and bad. Another, believe that God and his ways are better than the lies of human temptation. Next, just choose to pursue God's will and ways. Enjoy and remember a greater satisfaction, and last, hope for a future reward. Let's pray. Father, thank you just maybe for a time of remembering some of these fundamentals of the Christian life when it comes to sin and temptation, that we would heed the warning to take heed that we stand lest we fall. But we thank you that you are faithful in our temptation, that you are committed to see us through it, to cause us to endure it. Pray that you would make us committed to your escape route, which is not just a deliverance, take this away from me, but a commitment to do what you've asked us to do and trust in you. Pray to give us a heart of humility today and a purpose to put off